The fluorescent lights of the conference room felt like spotlights burning through my skin as I stood before the projector screen, my carefully prepared presentation slides blurring before my eyes. My name is Ana Martinez, and at 29 years old, I had designed 3 award-winning buildings in downtown Los Angeles. But at that moment, all I could think about was how my blazer stretched too tightly across my back and whether the executives from Morrison Development could see the sweat beading on my forehead. The room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the thunderous beating of my heart against my ribs. "Ms. Martinez, we're ready when you are," David Morrison said, his voice cutting through my spiraling thoughts. He sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by his team of impeccably dressed associates, their eyes fixed on me with professional expectation. This was it, the opportunity to design the new cultural center that would reshape downtown's skyline, a project that could define my career and establish my firm as a major player in commercial architecture. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat like broken glass. In that instant, I wasn't the talented architect who had graduated summa cum laude from USC or the professional who had spent 3 months perfecting this proposal. I was the overweight girl trying to disappear into the background, convinced that everyone in the room was judging not my work, but my appearance. My hands trembled as I clicked to the first slide, and when I finally managed to speak, my voice came out as barely a whisper. The presentation that should have been my triumph became my undoing. I rushed through slides I had memorized, stumbled over technical specifications I knew by heart, and watched as confusion and then disappointment settled over the faces of my potential clients. When Morrison's assistant checked her phone for the 3rd time, I knew I had lost them. 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours later, I was walking out of the building into the harsh California sun, my portfolio tucked under my arm and my dreams crumbling like poorly mixed concrete. The drive back to my apartment in Silver Lake was a blur of tears and self-recrimination. I pulled into my parking spot and sat in the car for what felt like hours, replaying every excruciating moment. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother back in São Paulo. "How did it go, minha filha? Did you wear the outfit I suggested? Remember, first impressions matter." Her words, meant to be supportive, felt like salt in an open wound. She had always been obsessed with appearances, constantly reminding me that successful women looked a certain way, moved through the world with a certain grace that she believed I lacked. That evening, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in months. I had been avoiding mirrors, avoiding photos, avoiding life itself, I realized. The woman staring back at me had accomplished so much professionally, but she was drowning in shame that had nothing to do with her abilities and everything to do with the number on the scale and the size tags on her clothes. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had just sabotaged the biggest opportunity of my career, not because I wasn't prepared or talented enough, but because I couldn't bear to be seen. The next morning arrived with typical Los Angeles perfection, 72 degrees and cloudless, mocking my internal storm. I called in sick to work, unable to face my colleagues who would undoubtedly hear about my disaster through the industry grapevine. Instead, I found myself walking aimlessly through Griffith Park, watching joggers pass by with their confident strides and athletic wear that seemed to belong to a different species than the loose, dark clothing I habitually wore to hide my body. It was there, sitting on a bench overlooking the city I loved but felt excluded from, that I made a decision. Not to lose weight to fit into some idealized mold or to please my mother or to win contracts, but to reclaim my life from the prison of shame I had built around myself. I pulled out my phone and searched for therapists who specialized in body image and self-esteem, then looked for fitness programs that focused on health rather than just weight loss. My fingers hesitated over the call button for several minutes before I finally pressed it. The voice that answered belonged to Marcus Thompson, a trainer and wellness coach whose website had caught my attention with its emphasis on mental strength alongside physical health. "Thompson Wellness, this is Marcus," he said, his voice warm and unhurried. I almost hung up, but something made me stay on the line. "Hi," I said, my voice shaky. "I need help, not just to lose weight, but to stop hating myself." There was a pause, and then he said something that would change everything. "That's the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me on a first call. Let's start there." That afternoon, I met Marcus at his studio in West Hollywood, a bright, welcoming space that felt more like a yoga retreat than a gym. He was nothing like the intimidating fitness influencers I had seen on Instagram, just a regular guy in his mid-30s with kind eyes and an easy smile. We didn't work out that first day. Instead, we talked. He asked me about my goals, but more importantly, he asked me about my fears, my history with my body, and what I really wanted to change. When I told him about the presentation disaster, he nodded knowingly. "The weight isn't your enemy," he said. "The shame is. We're going to work on both, but we start with the shame." As I drove home that evening, something felt different. For the first time in years, I had admitted out loud what I had been carrying silently, and the world hadn't ended. The sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I allowed myself to imagine a future where I could stand in any room, in front of any audience, and believe I deserved to be there. It wouldn't be easy, I knew. The voice in my head that whispered I wasn't enough had been there for so long it felt like part of me. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw my neighbor wave from her garden, I waved back instead of hurrying inside. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless, but it felt like the first step toward visibility, toward claiming space in a world I had been trying to shrink away from for far too long. 6 weeks into my journey with Marcus, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, shopping for workout clothes that weren't black. The sporting goods store in Pasadena was bustling with weekend shoppers, and normally I would have grabbed the first things that fit and fled, but Marcus had given me homework that seemed simple, yet felt revolutionary. Buy something that made me feel powerful, not hidden. I stood in the fitting room, trying on a deep purple athletic top, when my phone rang. It was my mother calling from São Paulo, her timing impeccable as always. "Anna, your cousin Julia just got engaged," she announced without preamble, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant a comparison was coming. "She lost 30 pounds for the wedding photos. You should see how beautiful she looks now." I stared at my reflection in the mirror, the purple fabric actually complementing my skin tone in a way I hadn't expected, and for once, I didn't let her words send me spiraling. "That's nice for Julia, Mai," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I have to go. I'm at the gym." It wasn't entirely true, but it was easier than explaining that I was learning to dress my body as it was now, not waiting for some future version of myself to deserve color and style. The following Monday brought an unexpected challenge at work. Our firm had been invited to pitch for another major project, this time a boutique hotel in Venice Beach, and my boss, Robert, wanted me to lead the presentation. My immediate instinct was to decline, to suggest someone else, anyone else, but Marcus's words from our last session echoed in my mind. "Every time you say no because of fear, you're agreeing with the shame." So I said yes, even as my stomach churned with familiar anxiety. That afternoon, I met with my colleague Sarah to discuss the project over coffee in the Arts District. Sarah was everything I felt I wasn't. Tall, conventionally beautiful, the kind of woman who could eat pasta at lunch without calculating calories for the rest of the week. But as we discussed design concepts and sustainability features, she said something that stopped me cold. "You know, Anna, I've always admired how you command a room with your ideas. I wish I had half your confidence when it comes to the actual work." I nearly laughed at the irony, but her sincerity was genuine. It was the first crack in my assumption that everyone saw me the way I saw myself. The days leading up to the presentation were a masterclass in facing my demons. Marcus had introduced me to strength training, not to shrink myself, but to feel the power in my body. "Your body has carried you through 29 years of life," he said during a particularly challenging session. "It's earned your respect, not your punishment." As I lifted weights I never thought I could handle, I began to understand the difference between challenging myself and punishing myself, a distinction that had been blurred for so long I'd forgotten it existed. 3 days before the presentation, I had my first session with Dr. Rebecca Chen, the therapist I'd finally worked up the courage to see. Her office in Los Feliz was a sanctuary of soft colors and natural light, and she listened without judgment as I unraveled years of shame that had been twisted so tightly around my sense of self that I couldn't tell where it ended, and I began. "You've been living as an apology," she observed gently. "What would happen if you stopped apologizing for existing?" The question haunted me in the best way possible. That evening I decided to practice my presentation at home, standing in front of my bedroom mirror in the purple athletic top I'd bought and my favorite jeans. As I went through my slides, explaining the design philosophy and the way natural light would flow through the hotel spaces, I caught glimpses of the architect I actually was: passionate, knowledgeable, creative. The woman in the mirror wasn't thin, might never be thin, but she was brilliant and deserving of being heard. For the first time, I could see both truths existing simultaneously. The night before the presentation, I couldn't sleep. But instead of spiraling into catastrophic thinking, I went for a walk through my neighborhood. Silver Lake at 2 a.m. was quiet, except for the occasional car and the distant sound of music from late-night gatherings. I found myself at the reservoir, the path lit by street lamps that created pools of golden light on the water. There, in the darkness, I practiced my presentation one more time, speaking to the night air and the sleeping city. A jogger passed by and gave me a thumbs up, probably thinking I was on a phone call, but I took it as a sign from the universe. The morning of the presentation arrived grey and humid, unusual for LA, with the kind of heavy air that promised afternoon rain. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy dress that fit properly instead of hiding in oversized clothes, and added a structured blazer that made me feel professional and capable. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see perfection, but I saw someone ready to be seen. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Remember, you're not performing for their approval. You're sharing your gift. There's a difference." I arrived at the hotel company's offices in Santa Monica early, using the extra time to center myself in my car. Through the windshield, I watched the morning unfold. People heading to work, grabbing coffee, living their lives without the weight of constant self-judgment. I wanted that freedom, and I realized with startling clarity that no number on a scale would give it to me. It was a choice I had to make, moment by moment, to stop treating myself as a problem to be solved. When I walked into that conference room, something had shifted. The faces around the table were still evaluating me, but I was no longer trying to read their thoughts about my body. Instead, I focused on what I had come to share, a vision for a hotel that would be a love letter to Venice Beach's artistic spirit. As I began speaking, my voice was clear and strong. I moved around the room with purpose, pointing out design elements, engaging with questions, letting my passion for the project shine through the armor of shame I had worn for so long. When I finished, 45 minutes later, the room erupted in genuine enthusiasm. We got the project, but more importantly, I had gotten myself back. The Venice Beach Hotel project consumed the next 3 months of my life, but in the best possible way. I found myself on site most mornings, watching the sunrise paint the construction scaffolding gold while discussing structural modifications with contractors who had initially been skeptical of a young female architect but had come to respect my expertise. It was during one of these early morning site visits that I met James, the landscape architect hired to design the hotel's rooftop garden. He was explaining his vision for incorporating native California plants, when I noticed he was actually looking at my face when he talked, not letting his eyes slide past me the way most men did, as if I were invisible or something to be politely ignored. "You're the architect who designed that meditation center in Malibu, aren't you?" James asked, his enthusiasm genuine. "I studied that project in grad school. The way you incorporated natural ventilation was genius." We spent the next hour discussing sustainable design, and not once did I feel the need to shrink myself or apologize for taking up space. When he suggested we grab lunch to continue the conversation, I said yes without the usual mental calculation of whether I deserved to be seen eating in public. My sessions with Marcus had evolved from basic fitness to what he called embodiment work. One particularly challenging Thursday, he had me boxing, not to burn calories but to feel my own power. "Every punch is you fighting back against someone who made you feel small," he said, holding the training pads steady. As my fists connected with the pads, I thought of every diet my mother had put me on since I was 12, every date who had called me pretty for a big girl, every time I had made myself smaller in meetings so as not to draw attention. The anger surprised me with its intensity, but Marcus just nodded. "Anger is just passion with nowhere to go. We're giving it somewhere to go." That weekend, my mother announced she was coming to visit from São Paulo, a surprise that would have once sent me into a panic spiral of crash dieting and frantic apartment cleaning. Instead, I felt oddly calm as I picked her up from LAX, even though her first words were, "You look different, Anna. Have you lost weight?" I had about 15 pounds over the past 4 months, but that wasn't what she was seeing. "I'm happier, I said simply, navigating the familiar traffic toward downtown. She studied me from the passenger seat with the intense scrutiny that only mothers can achieve, searching for the catch in my statement. I took her to my office the next day, wanting her to see the world I had built for myself beyond her expectations. As we walked through the studio, my colleagues greeted me warmly, and I introduced her to the team working on the Venice Hotel. She was quiet as I showed her the 3D renderings and the models, her fingers tracing the precise edges of my designs. "You did all this?" she asked, and for the first time I heard something like awe in her voice, untainted by qualifiers about my appearance. "Yes," I said, standing straighter. "I did." That evening, I took her to my training session with Marcus, expecting resistance or criticism. Instead, she watched as I deadlifted more than my body weight, as I moved through complex movements with growing confidence and control. Marcus treated her with the same warmth he showed everyone, and I saw her relax in a way she rarely did. Afterward, she was quiet on the drive home, finally saying, "I didn't know you were so strong." I wanted to tell her that I had always been strong, that she had just been too focused on my size to see it, but I simply said, "I'm learning to be." The breakthrough with my mother came unexpectedly over dinner at a small Brazilian restaurant in Culver City. The familiar flavors of home loosened something in both of us, and she began talking about her own mother, my grandmother, who had died when I was 10. "She always told me I was too fat to find a good husband," she said, pushing her rice around her plate. "Even after I married your father, even after I had you, she would pinch my arms and tell me to be careful or he would leave." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother, who had seemed like the source of all my body shame, had been carrying her own wounds all along. "I thought, if I could make you smaller, you wouldn't hurt the way I did," she continued, tears threading down her cheeks. "But I just passed the hurt along, didn't I?" We sat there in that restaurant, two women separated by a generation, but united by the same poisonous message that we weren't enough as we were. "We can stop it here," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "It ends with us." She squeezed my fingers tightly, and I felt something shift between us, a loosening of the grip that intergenerational trauma had on both our throats. The next few weeks brought a new challenge. The hotel company wanted me to present the project at a major industry conference in San Francisco, This wasn't just a room of executives, but hundreds of professionals, peers who would judge my work and, yes, probably my appearance too. Dr. Jen and I spent our sessions preparing, not by trying to eliminate my anxiety, but by learning to coexist with it. Anxiety is just excitement without breath, she said, teaching me grounding techniques that I practiced religiously. James had become a regular part of my life by then, our professional relationship evolving into friendship and then into something more. He invited me to go hiking in Topanga Canyon one Saturday, and I almost said no, imagining him having to slow his pace for me, seeing me sweaty and struggling. But I went anyway, and while I did sweat and occasionally struggle, I also made it to the top, where the view of the Pacific stretched endlessly blue. "You're incredible," he said, and the way he looked at me I knew he meant all of me, not in spite of my body, but inclusive of it. The week before the conference, I went shopping again, this time with Sarah from work, who had become an unexpected ally. We found a deep emerald dress that made me feel like an architect who happened to be in a larger body, not a large woman trying to be taken seriously as an architect. The distinction mattered. As I stood in the dressing room, I remembered the woman who had hidden in black and beige, who had apologized for existing, and I felt compassion for her. She had done the best she could with the tools she had, but I had better tools now. My mother extended her stay to attend the conference with me. The night before, she helped me practice my presentation in my hotel room, offering genuinely helpful feedback about pacing and emphasis. "You sound like someone who knows what she's talking about," she said with wonder. "I am someone who knows what she's talking about," I replied, and we both laughed at the simple truth of it. She had brought something from São Paulo, my grandmother's architect's compass that I hadn't known existed. She wanted to study architecture, my mother revealed, but her father said it wasn't for women, especially not fat women. I held the compass, feeling the weight of dreams deferred through generations, and promised myself I would carry them forward. The San Francisco Conference Center was a modernist cathedral of glass and steel, its soaring spaces filled with nearly 1,000 architecture professionals from around the world. As I stood backstage, waiting for my name to be called, I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, but alongside the familiar anxiety was something new: anticipation. I wanted to share this project that had become so meaningful to me. When they announced my name, I walked onto that stage, not as someone trying to hide, but as someone with something important to say. The presentation flowed like water. I talked about the Venice Hotel not just as a building, but as a love letter to the community, incorporating local artists' work, creating spaces that honored the neighborhood's bohemian history while serving modern travelers. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions that let me showcase not just the design, but the thinking behind it. When someone asked about the challenges of sustainable construction in coastal areas, I answered with authority earned from months of research and problem-solving. My body, which I had once seen as a barrier to being taken seriously, became simply the vessel through which my expertise flowed. Afterward, people approached me throughout the conference, wanting to discuss collaboration opportunities, asking for my card, treating me like exactly what I was, a talented professional with innovative ideas. James found me during a break, his face glowing with pride. "You owned that room," he said, and kissing him there in front of my peers felt like another small revolution against the voice that had told me I didn't deserve to be desired publicly. That evening, there was a gala dinner, the kind of event I would have previously avoided or attended briefly, hovering near the walls. But I sat at my assigned table, engaging in conversation with architects from Tokyo and London, sharing stories and laughing freely. My mother, seated beside me in an elegant navy dress we'd bought together, was telling a story about my first building blocks as a child, and I didn't feel embarrassed by her pride. When the DJ started playing, Sarah dragged me onto the dance floor, and I danced, really danced, not the self-conscious swaying I had perfected to take up as little space as possible, but with actual joy in movement. A month later, the Venice Hotel project broke ground officially, with a ceremony that included local officials and community members. I stood at the podium to speak about the vision for the space, wearing the purple athletic top that had started this journey under my blazer, a private reminder of how far I had come. In the audience, I could see Marcus, who had brought his wife and kids to celebrate, Dr. Chen, who had helped me excavate years of shame, and my mother, who had extended her visit indefinitely, claiming she needed to help me decorate my apartment, but really, I think, trying to learn who her daughter had become. The physical changes continued, slowly and sustainably. I had lost about 25 pounds total, but more importantly, I had gained strength I could feel in every movement. Marcus had transitioned me to a maintenance program focused on activities I actually enjoyed, rather than punishment disguised as exercise. I had discovered I loved swimming, the feeling of being held by water, moving through it with growing efficiency. The pool at the Los Feliz Recreation Center became my sanctuary, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts, while my body did something it was learning to do well. It was during one of these swimming sessions that I had what Dr. Chen would later call my integration moment. I was doing laps, focusing on my breathing, when I suddenly felt fully present in my body in a way I never had before. Not thinking about how I looked in my swimsuit or comparing myself to the other swimmers, just existing in the moment, in my skin, in the water. I started crying right there in the pool, tears mixing with chlorine, grieving for all the years I had spent at war with myself, while simultaneously feeling profound gratitude for finding peace. James and I had been together officially for 3 months when he suggested a trip to Catalina Island. The old me would have immediately thought about being in a swimsuit for an entire weekend, about beach photos, about all the ways my body might disappoint in a romantic setting. Instead, I said yes, and actually looked forward to it. We spent the weekend kayaking, hiking, eating fresh seafood without me once pulling up a calorie-counting app. When he took a photo of me laughing at dinner, backlit by the sunset, I asked him to send it to me instead of demanding he delete it. I made it my phone wallpaper, this image of a woman who looked genuinely happy, who happened to be me. The Venice Hotel project was halfway complete when Morrison Development reached out again. David Morrison himself called, saying he had been following the Venice project and was impressed by my evolution as an architect. They wanted me for their cultural center after all, if I was interested. I took a week to consider it, not because I doubted my ability, but because I wanted to make sure I was saying yes for the right reasons. In the end, I accepted, not to prove anything to anyone, but because it was an incredible opportunity to create something meaningful for the city I loved. My mother decided to return to São Paulo just as the jacarandas bloomed throughout Los Angeles, turning the city purple. Our relationship had transformed in ways neither of us had expected. She'd started seeing a therapist herself, working through her own body image issues and the generational trauma she had unconsciously passed down. On her last night, we cooked together in my apartment, making feijoada from my grandmother's recipe. "I'm proud of you," she said, and then clarified, "not because you lost weight, but because you found yourself. You were hiding, and now you're not." We held each other in my small kitchen, 2 women who had learned to see each other clearly for the first time. The year anniversary of my failed presentation arrived with little fanfare. I was on the Venice hotel site, discussing tile selections for the lobby, when I realized what day it was. The woman who had stood frozen in that conference room felt like a ghost from another life, someone I remembered with compassion but no longer recognized as myself. That evening, Marcus organized a small celebration at his studio, what he called a rebirthday party. It wasn't about before and after photos or numbers on a scale, but about acknowledging the courage it had taken to change not just my body, but my entire relationship with myself. As I stood there, surrounded by people who had witnessed and supported my transformation, James's arm around my waist, my mother on video call from Brazil, Sarah and my work colleagues raising glasses of champagne, I understood something fundamental. The confidence I had been searching for hadn't come from losing weight or achieving some ideal size. It had come from the radical act of accepting myself as a work in progress, from treating my body as a partner rather than an enemy, from believing I deserved to take up space in the world exactly as I was while working to become who I wanted to be. The next morning, I had my regular session with Dr. Chen. We had moved from weekly to monthly meetings, a sign of my progress that felt bittersweet. "How do you feel about where you are now?" she asked, her standard opening question that had once paralyzed me with its simplicity. "I feel like an architect," I said, then corrected myself. "No, I feel like Anna, who happens to be an architect, who happens to be on a health journey, who happens to be living her life without apology." She smiled. That particular therapist's smile that says more than words could. "That's integration," she said. "That's what healing looks like." Derm, the Venice Hotel, opened 6 months later to critical acclaim. Architecture Digest featured it on their cover, with a full spread that included a photo of me standing in the rooftop garden James had designed, wearing a well-fitted red dress that I had bought without agonizing over the size label. The article mentioned my weight loss journey only briefly, focusing instead on my innovative design philosophy and commitment to sustainable architecture. But I had insisted they include one line that mattered to me. Martinez's greatest construction project has been rebuilding her relationship with herself, creating a foundation strong enough to support not just buildings, but a life lived fully and without shame. Standing in that completed hotel, watching the sunset through the windows I had positioned to capture exactly this light, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 40 pounds lighter than my heaviest, yes, but infinitely heavier with self-respect, accomplishment, and joy. The number on the scale had become just that, a number, no longer the measure of my worth or the determinant of my happiness. I had built something far more important than any building, a self that could weather any storm, face any challenge, and stand in any room knowing I belonged there. The shame that had once controlled my life had been replaced not with pride in achieving some perfect body, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to be at home in her own skin, whatever size that skin happened to be. I was an architect of buildings, yes, but more importantly, I'd become the architect of my own life, designing it with intention, strength, and an abundance of self-compassion that would have seemed impossible just 18 months ago. This was my true construction project, and it would never really be finished, just constantly evolving, improving, growing stronger with each passing day.